Evening, everybody. Lovely to see so many people here. This is Republican Labour Education Forum. This is one of our Speakers Corner hot topic, and the hot topic that we're discussing today, of course, is the present crisis in Israel. We have three speakers who've agreed to come and talk to us. Steve Freeman's going to start off because he is our RLEF speaker, so he's going to introduce the topic. We're also delighted to have Tony Greenstein here and Glyn Secker from JVL. So I'm going to say no more, but to hand over to Steve to introduce the topic for us.
Okay, thank you, Carol and comrades. Obviously, I'm going to look at this from our perspective, from a Republican perspective. I wanted to begin, however, by saying on the 7th of January, there was a small protest of left-wing and pro-Palestinian parties gathered in Tel Aviv to oppose the Netanyahu coalition government and their plans to weaken the power of the Israeli Supreme Court. A week later, the size and scope of this demonstration shifted significantly as tens of thousands of people gathered in Tel Aviv and in other cities. It noted that gone were the Palestinian banners, and in their place was a sea of blue and white Israeli flags. So obviously, as a speaker for Republican Labour Education Forum, which was set up to promote democratic and Republican ideas and policies in the Labour movement, I thought that before I thought a bit more about this crisis, I wanted to say something about the principles which we might apply to thinking about this issue of Israel. First of all, I'd want to say that republicanism is fundamentally a secular and democratic idea about the state. It's very much about liberty and about equality and about, I suppose you say fraternity or I think international solidarity, brotherhood of man, it was called originally. And the demand for a democratic republic is the central demand. Therefore, as democratic republicans, we oppose all ethno-religious republics in principle, be that the Catholic Republic in Ireland, the Islamic Republic of Iran or Pakistan, a Hindu republic in India, if they were going to have one of those, they seem to be heading in that direction. The idea that any ethnic or religious population should be privileged within the state leads to a national supremacist ideology, white South Africa, Aryan Nazi Germany. And therefore, on those principles of democracy, equality for all citizens, we're totally opposed to the Jewish Republic of Israel and Zionism as its ideology. We're in favor of abolishing the Jewish Republic and replacing it with a democratic republic with full democracy and equality for all citizens, not least, of course, the 20% of Arab Israelis who are second-class citizens in their own country. And I think a second and very important point about republicanism and liberty from oppression was the one identified by Marx and Engels when he said, in relation to Ireland, that no nation can be free if it oppresses another nation. So the people of Israel will never be free whilst the oppression of the Palestinians continues. In denying liberty to the Palestinians, Israeli people are denying liberty to themselves. It's a kind of act of self-oppression, really. So I was thinking of three Republican questions posed by these events. One is, can Israel become a democratic republic, or must it continue on its same, I think, degeneration towards perhaps some kind of fascism, it seems to me. Can the Israeli people free themselves from Zionism? And can the Israeli people free themselves from Zionism without having a credible policy of securing a democratic peace with the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza? And I was reading a comment from an Israeli called Rami Hood, who is a director of a liberal Zionist think tank called the Burl Katz Nelson Center, where he was writing recently, the new struggle for Israeli democracy, he said, has highlighted that we are still fighting for a Zionism that means all these things: democracy, ending the occupation of the Palestinians, and achieving a more equal society. And he adds, erroneously, in my opinion, we can only achieve this in Israel through Zionism. Whereas my argument is you can only achieve that in Israel by getting rid of Zionism, by replacing the present Jewish Republic with a democratic republic. So that's my first general point. Second point is I wanted to talk about crisis of democracy. So we've been talking about the idea that there is a crisis of democracy in England and in the UK for some time now. And it simply means that the existing system of government and the constitution, its laws, are losing or have lost credibility, trust and confidence of the majority of people. We can think that millions of our fellow citizens are alienated from the existing political system. Now, that's a crisis that could last for a long time. You can see evidence of that in, I think, the Scottish independence referendum, in the Brexit referendum, in the proroguing of Parliament, in the crisis of the Good Friday Agreement. But at present, this in England, popular anger, alienation, distrust of politicians, but it hasn't gone to the streets. There is no mass democratic movement. Whereas in Israel, there is a massive crisis of democracy that has spilled onto the streets since January, with a series of street protests. I'm sure we've seen them all on the television: strikes, general strikes, hunger strikes, in opposition to these constitutional changes. 121 people have been, protesters have been injured, and 823 people have been arrested. One recent example, on July the 18th, when the protest leaders announced their intention to march from Kaplan Street in Tel Aviv to the Knesset in Jerusalem. Starting with a few hundred, it grew to be one of the largest ever demonstrations seen in Israeli history. On the 24th of July, after the Knesset passed the first of a series of these constitutional proposals, thousands of protesters blocked the streets in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And it included in this opposition reserve soldiers from the IDF, who said they refused to do their duty. There was striking doctors from the Israeli Medical Association. There was the Israeli Business Forum of the 150 largest companies. Workers, trade unionists, Arab citizens, those protesting for equal marriage. And it included the former MP, Ehud Barak, and the former IDF Deputy Chief of Staff, Yair Golan. So my next point about this mass movement is it points towards, my next point is this, that on the 27th of April, 200,000 supporters of Netanyahu's reforms gathered outside the Knesset. On the 23rd of July, 100,000 supporters of these reforms gathered outside gathered in Kaplan Street. Now, the point about this is saying it's not just a one-sided protest against these reforms. There are two sides mobilizing here. So one might think this has more of the character of a civil war between the two parts of Israeli society, the ultra-Orthodox and the settlers, and the more secular liberal Israelis. Isaac Herzog, the Israeli president, issued a statement on the 26th of July on the danger, and I can't pronounce this properly, but I'll do my best, Milshemet Achim, which means a war of brothers in Hebrew. It's a term for the danger of a civil war. So the president is warning that this internal challenge to the Jewish state was greater than anything seen ever before. I'm going to come to probably my last point, really. but I could, because I think one can talk a lot about the Constitution, but I'll maybe wait and see how that goes out in discussion. But I wanted to think about what is the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Israeli society. There was a rabbi called Meir Kahan, an American Israeli. In 1984, he was elected to the Israeli parliament for the ultra-nationalist KAK party on a program that even some members of the Likud party compared to the 1935 Nazi Nuremberg race laws. But Kahan understood the logic of Zionism, that non-Jews would be non-citizens or resident aliens and could be forcibly deported. He said, there's no question of setting up a democratic Israel because democracy means equal rights for all, irrespective of racial or religious origins. Therefore, democracy and Zionism cannot go together. Tony wrote about this. I'm sure you might remember he wrote about this in the Weekly Worker some time ago. And Tony said there, Meir Khan preached that Israel could either be a Jewish republic or a Jewish state or a democratic state. When he said that, he was speaking a truth that generations of left Zionists have preferred to ignore. So I think that Kahan posed the question correctly, the question of the contradiction correctly. A Jewish republic or a Jewish or Zionist republic or a democratic secular republic. And that's the contradiction that was there in 1948, was there in 2018 when the nation state law was adopted that defines Israel as a nation state of the Jewish people. And it's there today, it's coming to a head today. So the crisis of democracy in Israel, the possibility of a fundamental conflict which is taking place in Israeli society now.
Some very good points made. I'm going to bring Tony Greenstein in now, and then our third speaker will be Glyn Secker from JVL.
Okay, thank you, comrades, and thank you, Steve and Carol. I think if most people are aware of the demonstrations in Israel from the BBC and the media, then they're really no wiser about the causes of the demonstrations and the protest, still less the problems that lie at the heart of them and what they are really about. And that is what I will concentrate on. I mean, Steve mentioned my article some time ago when I quoted Kahana, who in essence was a Jewish Nazi. Let's be quite honest about it. And he was called as such even by fellow Zionists at the time, although they prefer to forget that now. The heart of the question is Israel a Jewish state or is it a democratic state? Because it has been a motive of both left Zionism and its right-wing equivalents. You can be one or the other, but you cannot be both. That is really my starting point, because these demonstrations are about a fight for Jewish democracy. They're not a fight for democracy in Israel. And when I speak about Israel, I'm really speaking about Greater Israel, because there is one regime which rules from the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, to the Jordan River. Although there are different, if you like, internal regimes within that, depending on whether it's Gaza or the West Bank or the Golan Heights or East Jerusalem or what's called Israel proper. But I really want to look at some of the background, because without the background, I don't think you can understand this conflict. The first thing to say is, I mean, whenever anyone speaks about Israel, they talk about its right to exist, and I've always said that no state has a right to exist, but Israel in particular is an artificial state. It's based not on its citizens. It doesn't claim to represent its citizens. It claims to represent its Jewish citizens, and indeed the Jewish people wherever they may live. So I, for example, have more rights. I can go to Israel anytime I choose. and claim citizenship and the right to live there and obtain grants and so on, whereas Palestinians who are born there and whose parents and family came from there have no such right. So there is nothing democratic about that state, but we have to remember it's a settler colonial state. And the justification when Zionism set out, it was a form of collective assimilation. It wanted to turn Jews wherever they lived into another people. So in the sense, it was a form of collective assimilation, but it was unable and has been unable to reproduce itself as yet another bourgeois state because of the way it was founded. And Zionism is integral to that project. When the Zionist movement began, because it was a small minority, a tiny minority within diaspora Jewry, it was vigorously opposed. It was seen as a form of Jewish anti-Semitism. The Zionist movement reached out to elements of the Orthodox Jews, because most Orthodox Jews saw it as a secular heresy, an attempt to force the hand of God. And they reached what you could call a Faustian pact. And the reason for this was very simple, that if a Jewish state was to be established in Palestine using the memory of the two temples and the ancient Jewish states and so on, then it needed to reach an agreement with at least a section of the Orthodox for one very simple reason, that if you're going to call it a Jewish state, then who defines who is a Jew? It has to be the rabbis. It can't be anybody else. And that is the contradiction that lies within the state, because the rabbis have always, therefore, and the rabbinical establishment have always held what could be called an iron grip on the definition of who is a Jew. And the question of who is a Jew runs throughout Israeli history. I can recommend a book, The Un-Jewish State by Akiva Orr, which goes through all the various court cases which define who is and who is not a Jew. And obviously, I don't want to go into this, but it's very important, because in Israel, if you're Jewish, you have immense privileges, even the poorest Jew, compared to somebody who is not Jewish. So it's important to be able to define accurately who is a member of the privileged class and who is not a member of the privileged class. And that was equally true in all other states which defined themselves racially. South Africa, who was white and who was not white. And they had a system of categorization there, coloreds, Indians, and of course blacks. The same in Nazi Germany, who was an Aryan. That was also important, and racial scientists devoted much of their time, and there were academic institutes set up to determine how you could accurately define who was a Jew. Though in the end, of course, it rested on who practiced Judaism, going back to 1870. So this is very important, and people may not know, for instance, there is a conversion authority in Israel which handles the matters of conversion of non-Jews to Jews, because of course you can convert. You can join, if you like, the racial hierarchy at the very top, but it specifically removes or specifically bars Palestinians from converting to become Jews. There's nothing in the Bible, the Torah, or the Talmud which says that certain categories of non-Jews are not eligible, but in Israel that is a matter of course. I mention all of these things because it's incredibly important to understanding the background to the present crisis. In a sense, the protesters want their cake and to eat it. They want a Jewish state, but they don't want the coercive nature of the rabbinical establishment with its rules about not driving on the Sabbath, closing down, and so on. And they also resent, of course, the privileged existence of the Orthodox, most of whom don't serve in the army, don't go to work, and who are subsidized in order to study in their own yeshivas in the West Bank and Jerusalem and elsewhere. So we can see those who come out onto the streets certainly want to preserve a secular state as they know it. But then what they don't want is to admit to the collective the Palestinians, the indigenous population. And on this, they are agreed. So, for example, and I give this only as an example, there is an agenda of the right wing, well, it's called right wing, and I'll leave that term for the moment, though right and left in Israel don't correlate to what we understand here as right and left. There's been a number of different laws passed and measures as part of the agenda of this far-right coalition, which the opposition have accepted. The most recent ones are, there's a law just been passed on sexual terrorism. So in that now, today, an Arab who rapes a Jewish woman will be classified as having done it for nationalistic purposes and will get a heavier sentence because of that, and this fear of Arab sexuality. I mean, it's bad enough you have rape, you would say, but if it's an Arab who rapes, then that is a particularly heinous offence. There was I say this in passing, there was some years ago an Arab man who was sentenced, who was convicted of rape by deception. What do I mean by deception? The Jewish woman he slept with didn't realize that he was an Arab. She thought he was Jewish, and therefore it was a consensual sexual liaison. But when it was found out that he deceived her and he wasn't Jewish, that was held to be rape. And this is an example. And of course, the whole idea of the sexuality of the oppressed, I mean, came out, I mean, in Germany, where Jews were also seen as leching and as sexual, if you like, predators over Aryan women, or the Black Peril, as it was called in Southern Africa. You always find this, and of course, in the southern states of the United States, the fear of black sexuality, which manifested itself in so many lynchings and so on. So this is a feature also of Israel. The second example I would give is the Admissions Committee law of 2011. I can't go into detail in it, but the Admissions Committee law allows small Jewish communities up to 400 families to basically exclude, through having an admission committee, anyone they don't like. And that really means Arabs in particular. It doesn't just apply to Arabs, but it applies to them in particular. This law has just been amended to increase the maximum limit of families from 400 to 700, and to also extend its geographic location from the Galilee and the Negev. This passed through with support, in essence, from the opposition. I think one Israeli Labour Party MP, member of the Knesset, opposed it. But a number of opposition members went into the lobbies to support it. And the rest of them, Yesh Atid it is, and National Unity, they simply didn't participate in the vote at all. So it's clear that much of the far-right agenda of the present government is not anathema to those who are going onto the streets to demonstrate for their own rights and their own democracy. I will go a couple of things. Firstly, there has been a real battle by supporters of the Palestinians within Israel to even take part in these demonstrations alongside Palestinian flags. And on occasions, they have actually been attacked, because when you actually see who are some of been the principal speakers and supporters in the Knesset, people like Benny Gantz, who promised to bomb Gaza back to the Stone Age, and Yair Lapid, or both of whom supported wholeheartedly and unreservedly the recent attack on Jenin, you actually see what the agenda of the leadership of these protests are, that the Palestinians are really an afterthought. The idea that you cannot have democracy in one part of the Israeli state without having it in another part, that, and as we are seeing, the repression that has been a matter of course, a norm for the West Bank, is slowly but surely coming home to roost. Steve mentioned, for example, that 121 Jewish demonstrators who've been injured, and Ben Gvir, who is the leading fascist in the Israeli government, and he's also police minister, incidentally, he's been urging on the police to become ever more vicious against the demonstrators. But I have to say, and certainly they have been much more violent than normal, but no one has been killed. If you saw these demonstrations or anything like them on the West Bank, then you would have mass casualties and deaths, and they would be in the hundreds. I mean, remember the right of return, the Great Return protest in Gaza in 2018. They didn't even cross the fence, the so-called border with Israel. Yet Israeli snipers took them out. Over 250 people were killed, including over 50 children. So you have to see that the level of repression against the Jewish demonstrators, although it's increasing, is nothing at all in comparison with the level of repression the Palestinians are experiencing. My own view is, I mean, we've had people like Ben Gvir of Jewish Power, Otzma Yehudit, come to power. And in the West, people have said, well, this just goes to show how democratic Israel is, that even fascists and ethnic cleansers can come to power. In Starmer's words, this makes Israel a robust, just democracy. And, I was thinking back, would people have said when Hitler came to power, this just goes to show how democratic the Weimar state was? I mean, it's an absolute absurdity. All the backgrounds and all the context to the present demonstrations has simply been eliminated. My own view on the demonstrations, and they have been massive, of course, is that in the end, the right wing will triumph, because demographically and politically, Zionism is engaged and embarked on a certain course. And without joining hands with the Palestinians, the indigenous population, which very few of the demonstrators are prepared to do, I do not believe that they can actually win. In the end, the Israeli state will continue to move down an ethno-nationalist direction. And of course, the Arabs, both Israeli Palestinians and Palestinians in the West Bank, will pay the price for it. Where Israel eventually goes, who knows? But I don't think it will be a very nice place.
Thank you very much, Tony. That was very well timed, actually, and some very shocking information there from you. Thank you very much. I'm just astonished at how bad things are for Palestinians in Israel. It is incredibly shocking. I'm going to go over to Glyn now, our third speaker. I'm going to bring Glyn in. Over to you, Glyn.
Okay, hi, thanks very much. I'm going to start off with a speech that I gave to the Nakba demo, the PSC Nakba demo in May. And it's basically going to state the Jewish position, the Jewish left position on this. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Jewish socialism, the Bund, and then about the rise of political Zionism, which Tony talked quite a lot about. And then I'm going to make a reference to an article in Haaretz, just flagged up today by Moshe Makova, by Amira Haas, which is a brilliant article. And I'll just relate some of the points that he makes about what's happening on the streets in Israel today and what should be happening. So we're seeing the start, I think, of a third Nakba, of mass ethnic cleansing by the racist endeavor that's the state of Israel. This isn't a new agenda limited to the rise of Gvir or Smotrich. It's the underlying tidal stream of political Zionism, which has driven Israel from its inception. No one is deceived by the shrill cries of Israel's sirens at the loss of Israeli democracy. It never was a democracy. It was always a sham. The consolidation of the 1948 Nakba was under the so-called left Mapai and the Israeli Labour parties, as was the 1967 Nakba and the military take of the occupation, as were the illegal settlements, as were thousands upon thousands of house demolitions. What's different now is that the mask has slipped and the real Israel is exposed. The desperate attempt to silence the media with the war crime murders of 45 journalists has failed. The assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh has served only to throw a spotlight on their atrocities and their program. Netanyahu, in a crisis, is doing what all autocrats do: use violence to generate national danger and national unity. Now, a word about Palestinian response to the near 4,000 Gazan deaths by Israel since 2007, including more than 132 this year. If Israel were blockaded like Gaza for 15 years, with its hospitals, schools, houses, power, water and sewage systems repeatedly bombed, and all diplomatic solutions failed, who in the world would criticize them if they used force to fight for their freedom? In fact, the UK would be supplying them, like Ukraine, with Storm missiles with no restrictions on their use. Netanyahu is playing into the hands of the Israeli extreme right, who openly demand the expulsion of the Palestinians, both from the occupied territories and from Israel. This is the driver of the pogroms of Haraway and Jenin. Their objective is a third Nakba. This is apartheid with a vengeance. This is a monster which we, as Jews, denounce with every bone of our being. It's a horror which all of us in Jews for Justice for Palestinians, Jewish Voice for Labour, Jewish Socialist Group, Jewish Voice for Peace, European Jews for a Just Peace, Independent Jewish Voices condemn as a total contradiction of what it means to us to be Jewish. Our humanity, our integrity is rooted in our solidarity with the Palestinians. We are two peoples with one future. A people who oppress another can never themselves be free. Long live Palestine, long live Gaza. From the river to the sea, we shall all be free. So often when I talk about the history of Israel and Palestine, I talk about the origins of Jewish socialism. I talk about the Bund, and I'll just, for those who may not know, I'll just do a thumbnail sketch. I presume actually most people will know of it, but during the period of industrialization in Eastern Europe, in areas that was the USSR, before the USSR was created, there was a big Jewish population, particularly in Poland, which is where half my family originated from. And as with all creations of industrialization, you got creation of a large working class, and therefore you got creation of a large Jewish working class. And that Jewish working class, like all working classes, got organized, and it built an organization called the Bund, which was a combination of a trade union, a welfare organization, and a political party. And it took part in the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917. It was fiercely opposed to Zionism, which was beginning at about the same period as the Bund, and particularly in the nationalist position that the Bund was developing, where the Bund, the nationalist position that was developing amongst the Zionists, and the Bundists said, where we live, this is our home, and this is where we have to fight racism, all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism. And that if we try to solve anti-Semitism by pursuing a nationalist solution, we will only recreate our own forms of racism. Well, how true that was as a prognosis of what Israel has turned into. Now, what I want to just mention briefly is what I describe as the genius of political Zionism. Zionism came to the fore after the destruction of Jewish socialism, after the collapse of the Russian Revolution, which the Bund was heavily involved in, mostly as Mensheviks, but also with the Bolsheviks. But when the Russian Revolution was destroyed by the invasion of Western armies and the collapse of the economy by 80%, which is enormously more serious than any collapse we've seen in recent times with recent crises of capitalism, the last banking crisis or whatever, which was about 8% of the economy. And many of the comrades of the revolution died fighting on the front in the First World War. So the revolution was hollowed out from the inside, and what was left was a shell of a communist party, which Stalin was able to take over and reproduce forms of racism and pogroms against Jews. But this political vacuum, the absence of Jewish socialism, was filled by Zionism, and particularly political Zionism, which triumphed over many other forms of Zionism, some of which were much less unacceptable. Humanist Zionism, for example. We had a humanist Zionist on our Jewish boat to Gaza in 2010, Reuven Moshkovich, when we tried to break the siege of Gaza. But what political Zionism did was to transfer the economic and the financial roles that stratas of Jews had established historically over centuries, and which Abe Leon, the Jewish socialist writer, termed turning Jews into a people class. We can discuss that because it's not quite straightforward. But what political Zionism did was to take this interlocutor role of being financiers and traders within particular national formations, particular countries, into a function for international powers with respect to particularly oil and the Suez Canal in the Middle East and North African theatre. And so quickly, Israel became the client of Western imperialism. It knew that its leaders knew they had to hitch themselves to the big powers in order to establish themselves. And so when people ask me, well, no, just before I mention that point, the American hold over the oil, the oil states in the period after the Second World War went through a period of instability because there was considerable militant action by the workers on the oil fields. The area was becoming unstable, and Israel played a key part in American interests in grabbing hold of the politics and exercising force in that area in Western interests. So it was very well placed to become a military industrial complex, which it is. So what have we got now? Well, I'll just make a few points referencing back to Amira Hass. I'll put his piece up in the chat later, but he calls it, "This is poetic revenge on Israelis' silence about the occupation." And he's basically saying in this piece, all your mass demonstrations on the streets have achieved nothing, and you really need to wake up to the reality. And the reality is that you as liberal Jews participating in the so-called liberal democracy, which he calls out as non-democracy, have been had this belief in this Israeli democracy. You've been happy going to restaurants in the cities, drinking in the bars, taking coffee, having a nice leisurely life of a Western democratic style, and pretending, if you didn't actually know what all this was based on, the oppression of the Palestinians and the complete denial of their human rights, and the huge violation of human rights that is central to the occupation. And therefore, what you have to do is go out and join the Palestinians and defend them, help them defend them against the attacks by the settlers and the army and the military police on their attacks on their homes, their houses, their farms, and put your money where your mouth is, really. And until you do that, there won't be anything, there'll be no possibility of any form of democracy in Israel. It's a really powerful piece. It's much more eloquent than I've done justice to it for. So, yeah, let's have a discussion about all this. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Glyn, for that talk. Very moving, actually, very moving indeed. I now want to throw this open to the floor. I've got two hands up already, Malcolm and Matthew. So I'm going to bring Malcolm in and then Matthew to ask questions. If you want to ask a question of a particular speaker, please do say so, and I can bring that speaker in to answer your question. If it's just a general contribution, then that's absolutely fine. So I'm going to bring Malcolm Malay in first.
First of all, I want to say that any of you who haven't read Zionism during the Holocaust should. It's an absolutely brilliant book. It's not easy to read because it's so detailed. But the thing I took away from it, which I thought was a very, I suppose it must be a true observation, is the reason that the Zionists could work with the Nazis during the Second World War, I mean, not in a very secondary role, was because they both had shared the same vision of a racially pure state. So even though the Nazis were against Jewish people, they could actually understand what the Zionists wanted to do. Another point I wanted to make quickly was that, as Tony says, that no state has a right to exist. And Israel, I'm sure you all know, was Ben Gurion, who'd been planning this since the First World War. I mean, he'd been obsessively planning to have a racially pure state in Palestine, as far as I could make out. And on the day that the British left, ran away, whatever word you want to use, he declared Israel to be a state, which was, he had no right to do that at all. So I don't even know why we call it Israel, and I prefer to call it Zionist-occupied Palestine. So the idea that Israel was ever a democracy is sort of quite, well, I don't know what the right word is, but it's obscene in a way. And why people can't see this, and why Western governments can't see this, and why we haven't, I'm not a member of the Labour Party, but I mean, why the leader of the Labour Party actually stands up and says, if you're not a Zionist, you're not welcome in the Labour Party. I mean, people just don't seem to understand what's going on. So what we have to admire about Zionists is they're pretty clever at putting across a load of stuff that's completely lies, basically. So that's all I wanted to say, really. But I'll just go back to say again, please read Tony's book. It's you learn an awful lot. I mean, I feel a bit embarrassed speaking in front of Tony because obviously he's so knowledgeable, and as others are. So I'll say thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. I'm going to bring Matthew in now. Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, comrades. Yeah, thanks. It was very, very useful. I think there's a couple of points I wanted to make. I mean, the first one I think that's really important and that is frequently mistaken in these parts is that, of course, Israel is a central part, as Tony made. Of course, Israel is a central part of the Zionist control of the imperialist control of the Middle East, and therefore it's not a case, as some people mistake, that it's a question of the Israelis interfering in politics in the imperialist countries. It's actually that the imperialist countries have a real and defined interest in maintaining Israel as their form of control. Which is why Starmer, as obviously an imperialist politician, he has that position. That he will maintain that no matter what the crimes of the Israeli state or whoever. And the thing is, of course, that clearly, as the imperial hegemon, the other end of the Israeli leash is in Washington. The Israelis have to pre-clear any significant military maneuver, including, for instance, the invasion of Jenin refugee camp recently, with Washington in advance. These things they don't do things without agreement. They can't because they rely on that support, and it's integrated into that system, and that's why obviously that Starmer has the position he does. The other thing, I think, the important thing about what's happening now in Israel is the depth of the split. And I think this is what has to be said. In terms of what we're seeing here, is that the Zionist project is disintegrating, clearly disintegrating. If you're looking at the situation, say, Israel's deeply in unequal countries, and probably it's almost as unequal as the US in terms of a split between the ruling class and the remainder of the population. The huge levels of poverty, obviously, particularly among Israeli Arabs, Israeli Palestinians, but even among Israeli Jews. But what you've seen, of course, is the mobilization. This thing has also seen a mass mobilization of the Israeli working class for the first time, almost in God knows how long. The fact that the history, the Israeli Jewish trade union has had struggled to control what's happened. That there's been a near general strike at some of these things. The ports have shut. The airport has been shut. The doctors have gone on strike. There is an enormous strike movement among the working class on this issue, and at the same time, also, of course, you're also seeing the position in which people are saying, core people who are core to the continued existence and functioning of the Israeli military are saying we will not serve under these conditions. Now that's just whatever we can criticize them politically and whatever else, but the fact that that's happening is extremely important. It actually threatens the entire thing. One, the mobilization of the working class, and two, the fact that people say we will not serve and we will not continue to support, the Israeli military. That's a huge split. Now, I mean, the thing is, I mean, I think the important point is that there are people who have said, and I think, I mean, mainly around the local Communist Party. I may have, will have political differences with the Communist Party, but all credit to them. They've actually gone on these demonstrations and said that we will raise the issue of Palestine. Doesn't matter what you do. This is core and central. We demand the right to demonstrate with the Palestinian flag on these demonstrations. We demand the right to raise the issue at all points, and all credit to them for doing it, because as people have said, it becomes the central issue of the whole question. You cannot obviously have a democracy in which you deny, half the population effectively, deny democracy. And the thing is, of course, the attack by the Israeli far right and the Israeli fascists actually is, I mean, it's extremely profound. I mean, they're talking about removing democratic rights from Israeli Palestinians. They're talking about attack, creating a national guard, effectively a fascist type organization to attack not only Israeli Palestinians and on the West Bank in particular, but also those liberal Israelis, or those refusing to take the line of the government. I mean, it's basically Ben-Gvir wishes to stage this huge repressive measure against half of Israeli society. I mean, it's we're at a very, very profound moment here, and the question is, okay, what then are the political conclusions that come from that, and then also, can it be, how is the question of the oppression of Palestinians inserted and forced into that movement, because that is the core question. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Some very important points raised there. I have 3 hands up. Would any of our speakers like to come in at this stage to answer any of those questions? Yes, I can see Glyn. I'm going to bring Glyn in to address those issues that have been raised so far.
Oh, okay, thanks. Yes, I put my hand up rather quickly, knowing that I'll probably come back later. But I just think one needs to be very careful about drawing a link between the Histrodot, the actions of Jewish workers in attempting to support this, what we believe to be a fake democracy, and the brave attempt by smaller groups to include the Palestinian demands against the occupation and take Palestinian flags onto the demos. They've actually been beaten off the demos, and the Histrodot is not raising any support at all, of course, for the Palestinians, because it doesn't really represent Palestinians. In fact, Palestinian migrant workers in Israel actually have to find other forms of organization. The Histrodot won't represent them. So in a way, what I think you have to look at the mass participation of workers and action in Israel at the moment along the same lines as the dockers who demonstrated in favor of Enoch Powell during those times of the rise of the National Front. Most Jewish Israeli workers are not allied with the Palestinian cause at all. Of course, there are exceptions to that, small numbers, but we just need to be careful about considering that. That's the only point I wanted to bring in at the moment.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Glyn. Yes, Tony, that would be great if you can come in and comment as well.
Yeah, I mean, Matthew is perfectly correct when he says this is a very profound crisis for the Israeli state and, if you like, the Israeli people and for Zionism itself. I have absolutely no doubt about that. If you like, those who are going onto the streets certainly want to preserve Israel as some form of bourgeois democracy for them and to preserve their rights. You know, just the right, for instance, not to be religious, for example, the right to not have to eat kosher food if they don't want to, at a very simple level, the right not to have a rabbi running their school because there's a religious education system. The problem is that the people who define the state as to who is Jewish are the rabbis. And it is the rabbinical settlers or the settler rabbis who are in the forefront of the settler colonization of Israel. And some of these people are really way off being the spiritual mentor of Ben-Gvir, who is the fascist police and security minister, is Rabbi Dov Lior, who is in effect the chief rabbi of the West Bank settlements. Dov Lior has come out and said that one Jewish fingernail is worth 1,000 non-Jewish lives. And there was another rabbi, I can't remember his name, at the funeral for Baruch Goldstein, who massacred 29 Palestinian worshippers when he opened fire with an automatic in the Ibrahimi Mosque in Jerusalem, who said one Jewish fingernail is worth 1 million non-Jewish lives. So take your pick. I mean, some of these settler rabbis who have incredible influence, not least within the army, are dictating the pace. And you see the secular demonstrators on the streets of Tel Aviv, on the one hand, want a Jewish state, but they don't want everything that comes with that Jewish state. And in that sense, they're caught in the bind. And I have to say about the Histadrut and the Jewish working class, that the Jewish working class in Israel doesn't vote for the so-called left, the moderate Zionists. It votes for Likud, and it votes further right than that. The Histadrut has an appalling racist record anyway, and its general secretary is a member of the Likud. The Israeli Labour Party is nowhere to be seen anymore. So you have this whole crisis coming to the boil in Israel, whereas in the West, these demonstrations are just portrayed as an example of Israeli democracy. So why has it taken the judicial form? And the reason is quite simple. The Supreme Court is the arbiter of all sorts of racist laws and interpretations of laws when it comes to Palestinians. They have set the legal seal of approval on the demolition of Palestinian homes, on the confiscation of land, etc. But when it comes to Israeli Jewish society, the Supreme Court has been a relatively liberal court. They've allowed the non-Orthodox to have a share in defining who is a Jew. They've allowed conversions, divorces, and so on. And so you're seeing this complete, if you like, contradiction between the Jewish and the democratic playing itself out. I might add, just for historical relevance, that Zionism was never a Jewish idea. It was a Christian idea, the idea of the Jewish return to Palestine, because of the strategic connotations, the route to India and so on. So Zionism had to seek this religious blessing, if you like, but at heart it was a strategic project of Western imperialism. I mean, the most ardent Zionists were people like Lord Palmerston, Lord Shaftesbury, Napoleon, and so on. The Jews didn't particularly want it because they could see through it. When non-Jews supported Zionism, that was because they didn't want them living in their society. So we now, of course, see all of this playing out in Israel. And whether Zionism is reaching its final conclusion, as Matthew inferred, I don't know. But it's certainly in a headlong rush towards a very nasty end, if you like. The question is how long those who acted as its apologists in the West, the New York Times, the Guardian, the BBC, and so on, pretending that it's somehow a form of Western bourgeois democracy, well, how long they can maintain that pretense, because they've turned they've turned a blind eye to all the iniquitous legislation so far, but there comes a time when reality will hit even the BBC in the face, whatever the protestations of the local Zionist lobbies. So again, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much.
I just want to make a quick apology on my own behalf. Tony picked up a point. For some reason, I started referring to Amira Hass as he. Amira is a woman. I beg her pardon.
Thank you very much, Glyn. I'm going to go back to the floor now. I've got Mike Hope and Agnes Corey coming in to speak. And then we'll take some of the speakers again to answer. So, Mike Hope.
Yeah, well, mine is a straight question, actually, which is, given that all we've heard about, and that we know anyway, about the origins of Israel and the way it has relied hitherto on a sort of more liberal cover for its fundamental sort of Zionist through and through approach from its very beginning. I think the real question is the state of Israel as such reformable, or is our position that the state of Israel as such has to be abolished so that a democratic state in that part of the world that includes all its inhabitants should be able to be created? Now, we're a long way from that, as we hear, given the lack of support for Palestinians, even from most of the Israeli left. But that's the basic question. Is it in any way reformable? Will we be talking about the need for another Israel being possible? Or are we talking about something else entirely? I think you gather from my view that I think it is something else entirely, but I'd like to hear that played out by everybody else.
Thank you very much, Mike. Very good question. I'm going to bring Agnes in now.
I'm a bit arrogant here because I'm not asking any questions. I just like to make some comments. One is that when people speak about the Zionists, it's a bit like people talking about the Labour Party. I mean, there are so many shades, even now, in the Labour Party. And there are so many shades among Zionists that I find it a bit hard to just talk about one sort of section of the Zionists as if it was the Zionism in all. That's one thing. The second thing is that there was some reference to the Bundists who said that, thank you very much, we want to live with the people wherever we are, that's our job. But that wasn't always possible, because quite often people returned after the Holocaust to their countries in Hungary and Poland and so on, and then they were welcomed with the comments that go back where you came from and so on. I mean, I know examples in Hungary that, you know, they just couldn't come back because their houses were taken away and so on and so on. And the last thing I would like to say, that yes, I'm sure that there were various ideas about forming the state of Israel, but also I know that there were a lot of enthusiastic so-called Zionists who went there because they were socialists, even communists, and they went to the kibbutz movement because that's where they saw where justice was. And I do have friends who did that, and so I'm speaking up for them. So please don't condemn all Zionists under the same umbrella. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you very much, Agnes. Anita has made a very good comment in the chat, and she said, interesting contribution, she said, the American hegemony is under threat as never before. The cost versus benefits for US of support for the pariah state in the Middle East can't be sustainable. I think that's a really good question as well. Matthew.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Thomas. I do think we shouldn't. I mean, I think the comparison between the Israeli working class and the Dockers supporting PAL isn't, exact. I mean, the thing is, what we've seen. I mean, the history bureaucracy clearly didn't want anything to happen at all. I mean, quite clearly they're integrated into the state. It was actually the workers themselves said, well, we're actually going to shut this stuff down, and they did. And it was it was the core operations of the economy, and the economy itself also is suffering because I mean things like Israel's built a considerable IT sector, and that the future of that is certainly in question because people say, why would we invest money in this wreck or mess or whatever else? The sort of stuff is up in the air. The point being is that the working class has moved into action politically against the government. Okay, we should be critical of its of politics and whatever else, but the question is, how do you actually pose the point? So, right, okay, well, you guys have moved into action against this government, but on an inadequate basis. And the question is, how do the people, as I say, the people who've been on the demonstrations and said, look, you have to take up the question of Palestine because that's the core of this whole business. And the point being, obviously, is that the driver, of course, is the settler movement. But the settler movement then means, of course, the enforcement effectively of a variety of some type of far right or fascist regime on the entire population. And obviously, that has produced resistance. And the question is, okay, well, where does it go? Politically, where does it go? How do you intervene in that? And I think that's the point you have to take. Under conditions. I mean, the point about the Americans and so on. I mean, the cost of Israel to the Americans is not particularly large. I mean, politically, obviously, they support it all over. They've tried to force all these different regimes in the Middle East to say, look, you should regularize your relations with the Israelis and all this sort of thing. And they clearly still supported Biden, obviously. But the point is, the instrument itself is falling apart. That's the problem they've got. Okay, there's obviously a rise of some questioning happening in the imperialist country, and the problem that the imperialists have got, of course, you can see why it is that they're now getting so sensitive about it, that they're now saying, okay, well, now this is now a live question, that therefore you can't talk about it. You're not allowed, to talk about it because this whole rubbish about anti-Semitism, it's in order to try and shut the whole thing down, because it's now become a question of the whole future of can the imperialists maintain this method of control in the Middle East? Can Israel as a state be maintained? This is now not a casual issue. It's live, and the whole thing's up. The ball's on the slates, as they say in Scotland. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Matthew. I'm going to bring Steve in now. Steve Freeman.
Thanks, Carol. I wanted to make a couple of points. One was, of course, that Israel, interesting enough, Israel doesn't have a written constitution. And the reason it didn't have a written constitution, even though in 1949, they actually, I think, elected a constituent assembly, but they couldn't sort out the contradictions of what kind of country they wanted to be. So they didn't get a constitution, along with New Zealand, about 2 or 3 other countries. Saudi Arabia don't have written constitutions, but there is a reason for that. Is because they've tried to fix it with various basic laws that they've added up over the period of years. And now we're getting to a point where that whole thing is starting to fall apart. The 2018 national law is just one of those. And the role of the Supreme Court, of course, is also deeply part of that crisis. I wanted to say that I agree very much with what Tony said about the Jewish Republic. It can't and never has been and cannot be democratic. But I also agree with Matthew's contribution, essentially, that the crisis is a very, very profound. I mean, I mentioned the idea of civil war, that's where it could go in a very, very deep crisis. And the problem is, if you have a democratic movement, the problem with a mass democratic movement is it brings all its old stuff to the party. We might think of Father Gapon's movement in 1905, a mass democratic movement in Russia, was full of all sorts of prejudices and nonsense and reaction and all sorts of things. It brings all that out into the thing. So the point is that if there's a mass democratic movement, it is changing the way that people will see Israel. And I agree with Tony that this democratic movement cannot win because it's fundamentally flawed because of its Zionist ideas. It can only win if it throws off its Zionist ideas. It will be forced to do that because otherwise the Netanyahu government can just simply start a war with the Palestinians and the whole thing falls apart at any moment. So it will fail because of its own contradictions. But on the other hand, it is putting those contradictions out to be resolved. And therefore, we as socialists must deal with the question of democracy in a non-Zionist way. There must be another answer to the problem of Israeli democracy that isn't a Zionist answer, an anti-Zionist answer. And that's what I think we need to address.
Thanks very much, Steve. There is a very interesting question in the chat from Cheryl Gaunt, and she asks, can one of the speakers explain why there are so many large demos in Israel right now? Why are the people up in arms aside from the issue of the independent judiciary? So would anyone like to come in and answer that question, please? Glyn's got his hand up. Okay. Glyn, if you'd like to come in and answer that question.
I mean, it goes back to what Tony was saying, was that the Israeli Supreme Court has been a very good guardian of the rights of the the Jewish citizens of Israel, particularly middle classes, and that protection that they see the court has against the rise of the religious Zionists is very important to them. And another reason is that I think they have really believed that it is the deciding principle of Israel, the independence of the judiciary, which establishes Israel as a Western democracy, quote. And without it, and because of the reactions that were taking place internationally with Netanyahu's drive to remove this power of independence from the Supreme Court, denigrate Israel internationally and its standing internationally, and opens it up to significant criticisms. There's a very strong feeling Israel is part of Europe. It's why you get it part of the international sports games and the Eurovision Song Contest and all this stuff. So it is actually quite an existential issue for very large numbers of people. I'd like to come back on Mike's question. Can Israel be reformed or should it be abolished? I've always argued that until Israel begins to become counterproductive to Western, particularly American interests in the Middle East, then no change will occur. But when it does become counterproductive, and it can do that, when Netanyahu threatened to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities and risked a whole new conflagration in the Middle East, Obama just said, no, I'm not going to enter another third war in the Middle East, and put down a red line, and Netanyahu backed off. And the chaos that is developing now and the power that the far right has got in Israel may again take it down such a route that it becomes unacceptable to America. But I'm afraid you have to be fairly sure that the solution that America will impose would not be one that we would want imposed. And so it doesn't create great hope at all. And then just come to Agnes' point. See, the Bund's slogan, Doch Hayat, this is where we live. This is where we fight, this is our homeland. Two things about that. Well, if you place that rather than about being about Jews, but say about African Caribbeans in this country, no African Caribbean movement is saying, oh, what we need to do is set up our own independent country somewhere. What they do is fight racism here and try to change the system. And the context when the Bund was making that claim was, of course, during a revolutionary period where they were part of making a tremendous transformation of society in 1917. But you obviously didn't hear me saying that whenever I talked about Zionism, I talked about political Zionism, which was one of the main strains of Zionism, which became the dominant form of Zionism and crushed the socialist Zionism and the humanist Zionism. I always tell the story of Reuben Moscovich, who was this Holocaust survivor who's on our boat to Gaza in 2010. He tells a story that he went out to Israel when he was liberated in the end of the First World War. Him and some other comrades, socialist comrades, went out and formed a kibbutz. And the kibbutz was fairly successful, and it grew. And obviously it elected a committee, and so it was quite big, and the committee was quite powerful, because obviously ran the kibbutz. And the committee chair one day said, we need more land. And Reuben said, sorry, you can't take any more land. All the surrounding land is owned by Palestinians. And the kibbutz said, well, tough, we're going to take it by force. And Reuben said, not over me, you're not. And thereby they chucked him off the kibbutz. He was actually qualified at university lecturing standards. They chucked him off the kibbutz along with his family and his young child at the time, and with other comrades. And he never found proper work again. He drove a forklift truck in the docks and so on, but he was always a casual worker. He stood up for his principles. And that's what the kibbutzim were not the socialist ideal that they portrayed themselves as when I was a student and was attracted to going to a kibbutz in my political ignorance in those days. The kibbutzim, one, they were never more than 3% of the Israeli economy, but actually they were the places where the captains of the armed forces were trained. The socialist kindergartens, where they took the children away from their parents, really followed the Jesuit maxim: you give me the child for the first 7 years of its life, and I will give you the adult. And when I was on this kibbutz in 1966, it was a very socialist kibbutz, quote, and everyone met in the canteen once a week to discuss what was going on, to parcel out the jobs. They made a clear point to us. All the dirty jobs were shared by everybody and so on. And, a couple of months in, we had one of these meetings and they said, and I said, we're meant to share out the dirty jobs. What about the guy, the plongeur, the guy who does the washing up? Nobody seems to take his place. He doesn't swap jobs. And I said, oh, no, it doesn't matter about him. He's Palestinian. And the scales dropped from my eyes fairly quickly then.
Wow. Thank you very much, Glyn. Wow. That's shocking.
Yeah.
If I can just bring Anita in first, then I'll come to you, Tony, okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Apologies, it's actually me, Gary Osterlenk, partner, who'd like to come in now. So I'd just like to ask a couple of quick questions. So Matthew may well be right that the economic cost to the US of propping up Israel is relatively small. I don't know. But what strikes me is that the geopolitical cost for America of maintaining this pariah state in the Middle East is actually quite huge, especially in a world where China and Russia are increasingly gaining influence, and America is losing hegemony and influence. And I am wondering whether the reason why this is happening now in Israel rather than 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, and that's what I've been trying to understand, is precisely because the state of Israel is feeling very vulnerable in this new world that's emerging. And is feeling very brittle because of the new world that's emerging. And I think that in the Qatar World Cup, it was quite astonishing. On TV boxes around the world, how most of the world was lauding Palestine and expressing solidarity with Palestine and refusing to even talk to Israeli reporters and journalists. Right, and that must be disturbing for the US. It must also be disturbing for Israel, obviously, but it must be disturbing for the US. Like Matthew, I think we all the cockles of our hearts are warmed when we hear Celtic and watch Celtic supporters waving their flags and chanting in solidarity with Palestine. The other question I wanted to raise very quickly was, I'm really intrigued about the Israeli Communist Party. I don't know anything about it. And I'd like to understand what their position is on the Israeli state and the existence of the Israeli state. Do they actually challenge the Israeli state, or are they pro-state, but then demanding some niceties within it?
Thanks very much, Gary. I'm going to bring Tony in to answer those extremely good questions.
Yeah, I'll start with the last one first because I remember it best. What is the position of the Israeli Communist Party, Hadash? Well, I think we have to remember, Glyn says he'll leave the Communist Party to me. Thank you, Glyn. I think we have to remember that, the Communist Party, which has played, a good role insofar as it was the only defender of the Palestinians within Israel since 1948, and one has to remember that. It was originally, of course, an anti-Zionist party. If you go back to the splits in Labour Zionism way back into the early 20s, I mean, the Histadrut supported deportation along with the British. I mean, they allied with the British to actually have them deported, these troublemakers. But slowly, I mean, they did gain a base in the Arab community. But what I think really changed the situation, it is really another topic, was when Stalin recognized and supported the creation of a Jewish state in the UN in 1947. This was not only opportunist, because he thought he'd get rid of British imperialism from the Middle East. He'd seen the fight of the Zionist militias against him, not realizing that US imperialism would simply take its place. But it destroyed almost the Arab parties throughout the Middle East. I mean, there were strong communist parties in Egypt, in Iraq, and in Syria. And the Palestine question was central to politics in the Middle East as a whole. And when Stalin decided he would jackknife and support the Zionist state, and not only support it, but he armed it. It was Czechoslovak weaponry and aircraft, which actually turned the balance. Then that really destroyed the support for communists throughout that region. And the problem with Hadash or Raqqa, as he used to call it, in Israel, is they've never been anti-Zionist. They've believed you can somehow have a democratic Israel, which includes its Arab or Palestinian citizens. So it still supports two states at a time when just about no one else does, because it lives according to this myth of somehow having a Jewish state, which is somehow a democratic state. But I mean, despite these political flaws, I mean, yes, I mean, it has been the sole repository of support for the Palestinians at a time when, from 1948 to 1966, all Palestinians, or nearly all Palestinians in Israel, were under military occupation. And let us not forget the Histadrut, which was part of the state. It wasn't never an independent trade union. It refused until 1959 to even admit Arabs to its membership. And even for another 7 years called itself the General Confederation of Hebrew Labour. It put all Arabs in a separate department. So, you know, Labour Zionism was the progenitor of everything that we see now. It wasn't an alternative. So I come to the question from Mike: is the Israeli state reformable? And that is an absolute no. As it is, as a Jewish state, it cannot be reformable. Would the apartheid state have been reformable as an apartheid state? Would the Nazi state have been reformable? I mean, to ask the question is to answer it. I mean, ethno-nationalist states are a particular variety of, if you like, capitalist states. When we look at Europe in the 30s, there were ethno-nationalist Christian states: Hungary, Slovakia, Croatia. I mean, when it came to the Holocaust, they were even more barbaric than Nazis. I mean, no one could outdo the Jasenovac extermination camp in Croatia, which was the only extermination camp not under the control of the Nazis. Ethno-nationalist states have a logic which is basically exterminationist in the end, certainly ethnic cleansing. And Israel is headed fast along that path. And certainly when the settlers cry death to the Arabs as they march in the streets, or may your villages burn, these are not just slogans. They actually do mean it. For them, a Palestinian is not a human being. So we do have to understand that what the logic of Zionism is today, and it's anything but democratic. But this is also, of course, what motivates the liberal bourgeoisie of Tel Aviv, in a sense. They look with horror at what's happening, and they realize they're also heading towards a theocratic state where Jewish law, halacha, plays an equal part, if not a more important part, than civil law. And this is why everything is bound up with the judicial reforms. because I mean, the agenda of the far right in Israel is that Jewish law, which only rabbis interpret, and there's no human rights aspect to that, will trump civil law, and that's not the kind of state that they want to operate in, because the Supreme Court, I mean, you know, it's presided over the coming eviction of Masafer Yatta. It's presided over the administrative detention without trial of Palestinians and so on. But it's very jealously guarded the rights of Israeli minorities. Reform Judaism, which is the predominant Judaism in America, it's defended their rights of conversion. That if someone is converted under the Reform law, they are a Jew under the law return. That is anathema to the Orthodox. I mean, my father was a Jewish rabbi, and you know, he used to tell me that a Reform Jew was worse than the Christian, and the Christian was pretty bad. So you get some measure of how these people are considered. They are traitors within the fold. They're even worse than the Palestinian enemy. As to the solution, I mean, Glynn says, well, he doesn't see a solution as long as America continues to see Israel in its as being in its interests. I'd pose it differently. I don't think we'll see the end of Zionism until the Arab masses overthrow the regimes that Israel has come to guard over. I think when those regimes fall, when American interests in the Arab East, the oil interests and so on, are threatened, then Washington will take another look, and a much closer look at what it is that it is fostering. Certainly in the West today, we have, I mean, people are increasingly supportive of the Palestinians, but we also see that the elites in our society are equally determined, and that's what the anti-Semitism nonsense is about, to protect the Israeli state by constructing a complete fiction about it. If I can deal very briefly with Agnes Corey, who is very brave to come here and put forward her point of view, can I say this? Of course, there are many Zionists who honestly believe that Zionism and democracy are compatible. You know, just as many people support immigration controls and would be horrified if you called them a racist, although immigration controls, certainly in Britain and the imperialist context, are racist. But Zionism itself is inevitably and inherently racist. And although people say, well, there's many varieties of Zionism, there was really only one dominant Zionism, and that was political Zionism. I would say socialist Zionism never took off, and there were many socialists who did believe in Zionism. Well, we can see that. I wrote in my book about the fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto, the socialist Zionists. Their movements in Israel or Palestine as it was then, told them to stop fighting and get out. The real fight was against the Arabs, not against the Nazis. So, I mean, this is socialist Zionism has never been socialist. And Zev Sternhol, who was a left Zionist, a Holocaust survivor, wrote a wonderful book, The Founding Myths of Israel, and he showed how socialist Zionism jettisoned any form, any attachment to Zionism with a merger between Hapoel Hatzer and Achdut HaAvadah in 1930. That was quite clear, and Ben Gurion coined the slogan, from class to nation. In other words, the class struggle for Israeli workers was against the Arabs, not against the Jewish bourgeoisie, because the socialist Zionists had the first task of creating the bourgeoisie in order then to fight against it. This was the nonsense of Borokhovism, complete nonsense, but that was how it developed. But we saw under Labour Zionism. In fact, I wrote an article in Tribune 30 years ago, and I said, nothing that Begin and Sharon have done that the Labour Zionists have not done before them. And in fact, Sharon, the arch-war criminal, came from the Labour Zionist ranks. So today we are seeing the outcome of that on the streets of Tel Aviv, that half of the Israeli Jewish population are recoiling in fear from the monster they've created, the Frankenstein. And we have to draw the conclusions we can, which is support for the Palestinian struggle, because they're the ones who are going to really suffer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. So I think Tony's had his concluding remarks already. I'd just like to invite, I mean, I'm aware of time now. I would like to invite Glyn and Steve to give their concluding remarks now, because I don't see any other hands up from the floor. So I'd like to go to Glyn and then to Steve.
Yeah, thanks very much. and thanks everyone for staying with it for so long. I haven't really got much to add, really. Tony's right about the prognosis for Israel. And he's right that what we have to do is keep fighting. And for me, if you like, and I'm sure for Tony, it's an existential thing. For solidarity with the Palestinians is part of who I am as a Jew. And it is something which, all sorts of other battles I'm involved in over my lifetime come and go. But, this is permanently part of me and will stay that way, of course. I think there's quite an opportunity now because of the horrors. On the one hand, the horrors that are happening in Israel-Palestine now, with the escalation of the attacks on the Palestinians, which begin to find their way into the edges of the mainstream media, but also because the Jewish communities here are beginning to split over the crisis. So extraordinarily, I couldn't believe it when I first read it. The Union of Jewish Students, the JSOCs, came out against the occupation. How long that will survive, we don't know. Because I'm sure the Jewish establishment bodies will get in there fairly quickly. But it does indicate some of the cracks that are appearing. But I don't hold out hope for significant alliances there. There'll be some important individuals maybe, but I think we have to find a way of getting the whole narrative out to the main mass of the population in this country. We have to find a way of getting around the algorithms of social media and the complete control of the newspapers and the broadcasters. And I think there are some ways of doing that which we need to explore because we already, from opinion polls, have pretty much the majority, certainly majority of young people on our side in terms of supporting Palestinian human rights. And I think we can make significant headway there. And of course, the other thing is we have to fight hard against this anti-boycott bill that's going through Parliament at the moment. Incredibly, it puts Israel at the core of this bill, which has created some problems for some of these members of the Israeli lobby because they think it singles them out in a way that's embarrassing. So we just have to be active, continue to be active and continue to fight. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Glyn. I'm just going now to Steve to give his concluding remarks.
Yes, okay. I think there are 9.1 million Israelis, 20% of them are Arabs, so they are not going to go away anywhere. They're going to continue to exist. 76% of Israelis are actually born in Israel. Now, pessimists think that the only way we can shake the Zionist state of Israel is for something to happen outside Israel, because nothing can happen, as it were, inside Israel. But what I think is that this movement, this democratic movement, this mass movement in Israel is hugely significant. And Glyn has just given us one example of it. It's not just going to shake up Israeli society, it's also going to shake up what's happening here. And it's going to shake up the support for Zionism, even in the Labour Party. That's going to be the ramifications of that. Now, of course, it doesn't happen itself unless people come forward with arguments. So the mass democratic movement in Israel and the importance of the Israeli working class in this, there has to be a democratic answer to the crisis of democracy in Israel. It's not restoring the Jewish Republic to what it was before Netanyahu started his reforms. The program that this mass movement have is to keep Israel as it was. That's not going to happen now. because the whole thing has been shaken up so far. And in that sense, I agree with the point that Matthew was making. We mustn't underestimate the significance of this in breaking the hold of Zionism, but it obviously requires socialists to intervene in it and to shape it in some way and to put an alternative approach towards it. So I think we have to look to the socialists in Israel to be able to come forward in ways of intervening in that.
Thank you very much, Steve. I think this has been an outstanding meeting. The speakers have been excellent, and the questions from the floor have also been excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who's attended, obviously particularly to Tony and Steve and Glyn. But thank you everyone else who's attended this evening. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your contributions.